Your dog is humping something in front of guests. Maybe it was a leg, maybe a throw pillow, maybe another dog at the park. You pulled them off, said something apologetic, and moved on, because the explanation felt obvious. It is a pleasure thing. That is what everyone assumes. That is what most vets will tell you when you bring it up. Neuter them. The problem resolves. Except for the owners sitting in that waiting room with a dog that was neutered 2 years ago, and the owners whose female dogs do it, and the owners whose 8-week-old puppies do it to each other, before their hormones have had any chance to develop at all. The sexual explanation sounds complete until you look at those cases, and then it falls apart. There is one specific situation in which this behavior is most likely to appear, and it is not the situation you would guess. We will get there. But to understand it, you need to understand what this behavior actually is first. Start with the neutering data, because it is where the assumption first cracks. Research conducted by Nielsen, Eckstein, and Hart at the University of California, Davis, published in 1997, and covering 57 dogs, found that castration reduced mounting behavior in roughly 60 to 70% of intact male dogs studied. That sounds like confirmation, but read that number in the other direction. In 30 to 40% of intact males, removing the hormonal driver produced no meaningful reduction at all. The behavior continued as though nothing had changed, and that is before accounting for females, spayed or intact, and neutered males years past the procedure, populations in which the sexual explanation has no mechanism to fall back on at all. If this were purely hormonal, the intervention would work reliably. It does not. Something else is driving it in a substantial share of dogs, and that something else is not a variation on the same theme. It is a different explanation entirely. The clearest evidence of that comes from puppies. Mounting behavior has been documented in puppies as young as 3 to 4 weeks of age, before any gonadal hormone production is relevant, before the reproductive system is functional in any sense. John Paul Scott and John L. Fuller at the Jackson Laboratory, in their foundational multi-breed, multi-year study of domestic dog development published in 1965, documented mounting as part of the earliest social play repertoire, occurring symmetrically between male and female puppies with no hormonal correlation. Think about what that means. This is not a behavior that begins as sexual and then gets repurposed as dogs age or lose their hormones. It begins in the social play context, before sex is biologically possible. The sexual expression, when it arrives in intact dogs at maturity, overlays a structure that was already there. The behavior has a social and developmental origin. Understanding what that origin is changes everything about how you interpret what you are watching. For decades, the alternative explanation was dominance. The humping dog is asserting rank. The solution is to establish yourself as pack leader and correct the behavior firmly. This interpretation was borrowed almost directly from wolf research, specifically from Rudolf Schenkel's 1947 observations of captive wolves, which produced the alpha, beta, and omega hierarchy that shaped dog training for a generation. The problem is that this model has since been specifically tested and found not to hold. David Meck, one of the foremost wolf researchers and the scientist most associated with the alpha wolf concept, published a detailed revision in 2008, documenting that the captive wolf behavior Schenkel observed was an artifact of forced cohabitation between unrelated animals, not a representation of how canid social groups actually organize. And when researchers tested dominance hierarchies directly in free-ranging domestic dogs, a study conducted by Cafazzo, Natoli, and colleagues at the Istituto Zooprofilattico Sperimentale in Rome, published in 2010, and observing 27 dogs over 3 years, mounting did not reliably predict stable dominance relationships and was not consistently performed by higher-ranking individuals. That is not dominance assertion. That is a behavior that has been misread through a framework built on flawed data. So if it is not hormonal in a large share of cases, and if it is not dominance, the next question is what the timing of the behavior actually reveals. Pay attention to when it happens. A dog that mounts when guests arrive. A dog that mounts during high-energy play, specifically at the peak of excitement. A dog that mounts another dog, not as a greeting, but at the moment the social situation becomes most charged. These are not random moments. They are all arousal elevation events. Dr. Karen Overall, in her clinical reference work on small animal behavior, published in 1997, classifies mounting in neutered animals primarily as a manifestation of social arousal and inadequate impulse regulation, not sexual motivation. The mechanism she describes is overflow. Arousal exceeds the dog's capacity to manage it internally, and a stereotyped motor pattern discharges the surplus. The dog humping a guest's leg is not exhibiting interest in the guest. It is exhibiting a system that has been pushed past its threshold and is cycling through the only available outlet. That is not a sex drive misfiring. That is a regulation failure. Once the frame shifts from motivation to regulation, the picture of which dogs are affected changes too. A survey study conducted by Emily Blackwell and colleagues at the University of Bristol, covering 1,552 dog owners, examined problem behaviors, including mounting, and found meaningful correlations with owner inconsistency in response. Specifically, owners who interrupted or punished the behavior on some occasions and ignored it on others. That inconsistent response pattern was more predictive of persistent mounting than the dog's age, sex, or neuter status. Think about that. The variable that most shaped whether the behavior continued was not inside the dog. It was in how the people around the dog responded to it, and specifically in the unpredictability of that response. A dog that cannot predict what a given behavior will produce cannot update its behavior accordingly. The arousal does not decrease. The outlet remains active. The pattern locks in, which brings us to what was promised at the beginning. There is one specific situation in which this behavior is most likely to intensify, and it is not high excitement or sexual provocation. It is social stress. Dogs whose mounting is driven by arousal dysregulation use the behavior as a self-regulatory mechanism. It is the tool the nervous system reaches for when the situation becomes overwhelming, and the standard owner response, interruption, correction, punishment, removes the tool without addressing the underlying state that required it. Dr. Overall and other clinical behaviorists have documented that in these dogs, suppression alone produces a predictable downstream effect. The arousal finds a different outlet, and that outlet is frequently harder to manage. Redirected reactivity, compulsive licking, increased volatility in the situations that previously triggered mounting. The behavior that was embarrassing turns into something that is genuinely destabilizing. This is not what owners are told. Most owners are told to stop it. Stop it firmly and consistently, and the problem resolves. In dogs where mounting is an arousal overflow mechanism, that advice addresses the output while the cause continues to accumulate. The intervention that actually works is directed at a different level entirely. Behavioral medicine recommendations grounded in the American Veterinary Society of Animal Behavior's position. Statements on arousal-based behavior center on three things: identifying the specific trigger that produces the arousal spike, building the dog's capacity to disengage through structured training that rewards impulse regulation rather than punishes its failure, and ensuring that the dog's daily environment provides enough cognitive and physical output to lower the arousal baseline before those triggering situations arrive. For dogs whose mounting is concentrated in specific contexts, guests arriving, a particular play partner, a specific social configuration, managing those contexts reduces the behavior not by suppressing it, but by keeping the arousal spike below the threshold where the overflow mechanism activates. You are not correcting the behavior. You are removing the conditions that required it. Every owner who has been mortified by this behavior has been managing it from the wrong end, treating the output, responding to the symptom while the cause continues to build underneath. What the research shows across developmental study, behavioral survey, and clinical practice is that a dog engaging in this behavior compulsively is not a badly trained dog or a sexually frustrated one. It is a dog whose arousal regulation system is overloaded and whose history, including the history of how this behavior was responded to, has not provided it with better tools. The behavior is legible. It is pointing at something specific. Reading it correctly is not a matter of lowering your expectations for the dog. It is a matter of asking the right question. Not why is my dog doing this, but what is my dog trying to manage, and what have I given them to manage it with? If you want to understand what else your dog is signaling through behavior most people write off entirely, the next video covers the one response most owners call stubbornness, and the research behind it is not what anyone expects.